Hey, hello everyone. Welcome to the April 2023 meeting of the Mid-Atlantic Fishery Management Council. I'd like to take this time to call the council to order. My name is Mike Luisi and I'm the chair of the council and will be presiding over the meeting over the next few days. I would like to say that it's great to be back. I had a pretty rough winter, but able to deal with the personal issues and things that were happening. But I told Chris, I felt like on Saturday night, or I guess it was Sunday, it was kind of like Christmas Eve all over again. It was like, it was just nice to be able to get away and see friends I haven't seen in a while. And I just want to welcome all of you. We are located here in Durham, North Carolina, and looking forward to a great meeting week. We have a lot on the agenda for the next couple days. And well, before I say that, I do want to also extend my thanks to Vice Chair Towson for standing in for me during the times when I wasn't able to participate at the council. So thanks, Wes, for stepping up. I really appreciate it. Okay, so to the task at hand. The first item on today's agenda is a short-term forecast of species distributions for fisheries management project. We have a couple folks that are going to be part of the discussion. We have Malin Pinsky from Rutgers University and Alexa Fredston from the University of California, Santa Cruz. They're both online. And Brandon Muffley with council staff is here with us in the room. So I'm going to turn things over to Brandon for any opening remarks before we get to the presentation. So it's all you, Brandon.
Great, thanks, Mr. Chair. I am actually I'll start the presentation, then we have a sort of tag team approach here with Malin and Alexa, and actually Dr. Rago will jump in here later on to provide SSC comments. So you'll hear from a bunch of folks as we work through this. And so today is really to give the council an update in regards to where we are with this project that the council's been collaborating on with Malin and Alexa. And I think we have some really interesting results and information to show, and looking for council feedback in regards to where we may want to go with this particular project. So with that, we have a number of different topics that we plan to discuss for the project. We just want to sort of recap why we started this project and what the goals of the project were. We'll go over the modeling approach and how the model was developed. Go over some of the preliminary results and outputs that we have, particularly for summer flounder. We'll cover some of the areas where this type of information could potentially be used in management and science to help inform council decisions. We've presented this information to the EOP committee and AP and also the SSC. So we have all of their feedback that we will present to you, and then we'll open it up for council discussion. And so with all that, I really wanted to start off the presentation to remind you that the council has been interested in this type of research for quite a long time, actually. And this is something you all have been engaged in and been thinking about for a number of years. And so as council and stakeholders were seeing changes out on the water several years ago, the council started thinking about changes in stock distributions and what that might mean for the council managed fisheries and how we manage those resources. And so as you all were putting together your EAFM guidance document, you thought about this distribution shift and the impacts from climate change quite a lot throughout that document. And I just put a few examples of EAFM policies and recommendations that are quite relevant to this particular research project, and I'll just highlight them quickly. So one of them is developing approaches for management to become more adaptive. And so having that information so that you understand what potential changes might look like in the future, and having that information and how can you respond to that. Developing models for short-term forecasts and medium-term projections. Well, that's what this project is specifically aimed at beginning to do, is develop these short-term forecasts. And then identify new species that are likely to become established in the Mid-Atlantic from South Atlantic and species that are likely to expand or shift their distribution into New England. And so again, that's what this project is aimed at doing, understanding how Mid-Atlantic Council managed fisheries are moving and throughout the water, and how South Atlantic Council species may be moving into the Mid-Atlantic. So I just wanted to note those areas within our guidance document that you already have been thinking about this kind of work for quite some time. And the council's been engaged in this work with Malin on previous projects, actually. So Rich Seagraves, who was in my spot before I joined the council, worked with Malin and Jim Morley on a distribution shift project several years ago. And that was looking at thermal habitats and how that might be changing and how stocks are going to respond to that. And I was looking at how distribution shifts may be looking over the next century. And so you've used information like that. You've used information like the Herodall work that on species vulnerability assessments. You've used that kind of information in a more sort of informative and strategic way. So thinking about your EAFM guidance document that you put together. So thinking about sort of those implications for more of the long term. And what we're hoping to achieve through this project is, as you all know, you're making management decisions within the short term, thinking about where stocks and what their distribution and what their productivity may be in the short term. And so that's what this project is really getting at. So maybe we can utilize this information in a more tactical way, thinking about how our stocks are moving, but also thinking about what are the potential issues we may be facing with South Atlantic Council species moving into our area. And so with sort of that introduction, thinking about why the council is interested in this kind of work, I'm going to turn things over to Malin to move us through some of the additional background on the project.
Thanks, Brandon, and thanks to Mr. Chair and the council for welcoming us today in this hybrid format. As Brandon mentioned, the climate vulnerability assessment highlighted that many of the mid-Atlantic species are likely to shift their distributions over the coming decades, and that those shifts can present challenges. The other other piece I wanted to point out as background is that species in this region have already shifted quite a bit. This is a figure from NOAA's relatively new distribution and mapping portal. It shows the average change in latitude through time for species in the spring bottom trawl survey. But I also want to point out that species on the move include blue line pilefish that shifted into the region and offered new fishing opportunities. And I think that's an important point, that these shifts provide important opportunities as well as challenges, and that more broadly, adaptation is really important to ensure there are continued fishing opportunities in this region, and that ignoring these changes or not adapting will probably be more detrimental than working with them. The other piece I wanted to say was that these species are sensitive to both climate change and climate variability, that there's the long-term warming component, but there's a very strong variability signal as well. So that in any given year, a species might shift north or shift south, or inshore or offshore. So even if there's a long-term trend that's poleward, the short-term adaptation can be in other directions. And that's a case where short-term forecasts are especially helpful and likely really important. And I think that's probably part of the reason that the council recognized short-term forecasts as a priority. And part of the reason that we've been building our forecast system explicitly around the idea that these shifts can be in many different directions, and trying to understand the environmental drivers behind them. Next slide. Possible to jump to the next slide, Brandon? Thanks. Awesome. So that context sets the stage for our research project. It's been being conducted and has been conducted in collaboration with Brandon and with the council more broadly. And it has three main components. The first is to develop and test retrospective forecasts of species distributions from what are called dynamic range models. And these are models that explicitly consider demographic processes that all of you are familiar with, processes like mortality and recruitment, as well as dispersal. And there are good reasons to think that those processes are going to be very important for making effective short-term forecasts. The other piece is that these are retrospective forecasts. And what that means is that it's a forecast, but starting from some time in the past, like the year 2006. And the benefit from a research perspective as we learn how these tools work and what they're good at, what they're not good at, is that we can compare our forecasts against observations of what actually happened 2007, 2008, and subsequent years. That really lets us test the skill of the methods and also refine them. And that's a really important first step as we move towards developing useful and operational forecasts of the future. So this project really is a proof of concept as we try to develop a tool that the council can continue pursuing. So next slide. A second goal is to make the tools for these models openly available for wider use. We've received extensive interest in these methods, and it's going to require a real community of researchers and managers as we to continue developing them in the many directions that they can be useful. Next slide. And finally, this is a learning process also to learn how these forecasts can be incorporated into management decisions. Brandon explained some of those areas, and he'll get into more of that towards the end of our presentation. But this meeting with the council and previous meetings with the EOP and AP and with the SSC these are all part of that exploration and collaborative learning process that we can continue to develop the research and the products and visualizations in a way that can be most useful for fisheries management. Next slide. I just wanted to state up front what we're not doing right now. The next slide. So while we're testing methods that can forecast the future, this particular project is not producing those forecasts, whether for 2024, 2025, or beyond. Making future forecasts to guide management will require additional development and will likely require better integration with oceanographic forecasts as well. Next slide. In addition, this has been a research project to develop tools. Operationalizing that forecast system from this project for routine management use would require a future round of funding. So that is a direction we're interested in going. Next slide. And I also want to point out that we focus on species spatial distributions. They're geographic distributions. We're not focused on stock abundance. We are not trying to produce a stock assessment. There are plenty of much more effective tools for that right now. And finally, we're not producing management advice. We're developing tools that we hope can help the council make more effective decisions. Next slide. So that brings us to this project and our central questions. So we're investigating these tools called dynamic range models. We're testing whether they can forecast changes in species distribution. Next slide. We're also testing how far into the future those forecasts have useful skill, anywhere from 1 to 10 years into the future. And finally, next slide, we're trying to understand whether the skill of these forecasts improves when we consider the impacts of fishing on species and species distributions. Next slide. So in collaboration with Brandon and with others, we identified 4 focal species for us to test our forecasting methods on. You'll see results primarily from one of these today, summer flounder. And these 4 were chosen really for research needs based on data availability and the challenges that these different kinds of species present and the range of life history types that they present. Squid is in there as a species with quite a fast life history. Dogfish for a species with a very slow life history. Summer flounder are of interest because of past shifts in distribution within the mid-Atlantic, and triggerfish as a species that may shift into the mid-Atlantic in the future. We are well aware with data issues around squid, which also provides something of a useful test for this method because of those challenges. And with that, we can jump to the next slide, and I'll turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Alexa Fredson.
Thanks, Malin, and thanks everyone for joining today. As Brandon said at the start, I'm now at UC Santa Cruz, but this is all research that Malin and I did together at Rutgers University. So I'm going to walk you through some of the details of these models we developed, some preliminary results, especially in the context of those research questions that Malin just outlined for you. But I'll start out with the biggest results, which is that the first major finding we want to share is that we find that ranges are really influenced by non-climate factors in this approach, in addition to climate alone. This is probably old news to you, right? Anyone who's spent time out on the water knows that fish are not just marching in response to temperature change. But I think one strength of the approach that we've taken, which I'll outline for you momentarily, is that it can simultaneously incorporate all of these processes. So accounting for fishing, accounting for dispersal between nearby populations, all help us understand species distributions. Malin alluded to this earlier, but we also find that species are not just marching up the coast. Their distributions are highly variable, and especially at short timescales, sometimes they shift south. So one thing that we really wanted to be sure this model can do, and as you'll see that it will do, is predict that species may shift south depending on oceanographic and other conditions. And finally, we do find that these models are effective at forecasting species ranges. We are still in the process of doing a really formal comparison between the models that we've developed and other approaches, and I'll talk about that at the end. But we are confident that they have skill in forecasting some aspects of species distributions, and thus will hopefully be useful for eventually influencing management decisions. Next slide. Our general approach for this project has been to start with historical data. We've been using the Northeast Bottom Trawl Survey for the species that I'm going to walk you through this model on, which is summer flounder. And then we split the historical bottom trawl survey into two pieces. The first is the training set, and that's what the model sees. We give the model these data so that it can infer all of the important processes going on kind of under the hood with these populations. And then, next slide, we ask the model to forecast the future. Of course, this isn't the actual future, it's the past. We're just not showing those data to the model. So we call this a retrospective forecast, when you forecast something that's already happened. And it's a common approach in modeling to be really confident in how precise your forecasts are, which obviously is really important in the context of fisheries, so that we can communicate to you how much skill you can expect from these models before, as Malin said, future work potentially moves towards operationalizing them as future forecasts. So our hope is that the test will look something like it did in the last slide, but of course it's possible that the model will kind of go off the rails and forecast something that's really either way too high or, as you'll see in the next slide, way too low. Next slide. More specifically, we've been taking the bottom trawl surveys and carving them up into what we call patches, which are these little spatial zones. They're each 1 degree in latitude high that you see on the slide. The training years are 1972 to 2006. So we give the model data on how many, let's say, summer flounder were caught in the bottom trawl survey. We at the moment are just using one season fall in each of those patches in each of the training years from 72 to 2006. Next slide. And the retrospective forecast is done from the following decade, 2007 to 2016. Again, we all know what happened in those years, but the model doesn't. So this is our chance to explore how well it actually works. Once again, really a proof of concept, not a future forecast. Next slide. So I'm going to get into the weeds a little bit in the model structure, just to give you a taste of what's happening with it, and also to emphasize that this is kind of a new way of thinking about species distributions. A lot of the previous work, including previous partnerships with the Council and Malin and Jim Morley and others that Brandon mentioned, have used statistical approaches that correlate where species are found in the oceans with environmental conditions. We were hoping that in the short term, we could sort of outperform those methods by using a more population dynamic based approach, where we actually explicitly account for things like recruitment, dispersal, fishing effects on abundance, population dynamics, age structure. From modeling those things over space, the range shifts will kind of emerge, but potentially accounting for the boom-bust dynamics and short-term processes that are probably really important for near-term forecasting. So that's kind of the rationale for this approach, which will look a little different than other species distribution models you've seen. In each of those patches in the map I showed you a moment ago, we have a stage-structured, or rather age-structured population. This population is aging in between years. It's a discrete time model, so every time step is currently a year. The individuals in each age class also die every year at some rate, and the adults produce offspring via self-recruitment within each patch. Next slide. Like I said, this little gray bubble on the right corresponds to one of our study patches, but as you'll see in the next slide, there are several. In fact, there are about 10 along the coast, and each of those sort of, you can think of having its own gray bubble with its own population of summer flounder that are aging, dying, and recruiting. They also exchange individuals between the patches, and that can happen either via kind of a relatively global self-recruitment process, or sorry, relatively global recruitment process in which the youngest age classes are exchanged, or the adults can literally move between adjacent patches as if they were swimming via adult migration. So far I've kind of showed you that this is a spatially structured population model, but I haven't yet showed you the temperature effect, which is on the next slide. And that's where we can kind of simulate the effects of a warming ocean. In the models that we've designed, we can move around the effects of temperature on various parameters. Everything in an orange arrow is a parameter in the model. So we have the option to simulate whether the spatial distribution of a species like summer flounder is responding to temperature in the mortality rate, or in the recruitment rate, or in the migration rate between adjacent patches. And I'll show you results for all of those. Next slide. So I just mentioned all of these different ways that temperature can affect population dynamics, which is this list in the bottom left. But I also wanted to emphasize that in developing this model, we thought through a number of options that we might want to explore that represent different hypotheses for how spatial population dynamics actually play out for these species. And you might imagine that these will vary among the 4 species that we are modeling, and also that you might want to test different ones. These include making recruitment more or less stochastic, using fishing data from the stock assessment. All the models I'll show you today do use fishing data from the stock assessment, or rather the fishing and natural mortality values, but we might not have those for other species, so we do have the ability to turn that off. And I'll show you some models that do and don't have a stock recruit relationship in them, but again, that's something that we explore to see whether it sort of helps or hinders our ability to forecast the range shifts. Next slide. So I'm going to show you some plots of how these models actually work, and keep in mind, we keep saying things like proof of concept, but the reason that we wanted to walk you through these today is to give you a sense of the type of information they might be able to provide to start a conversation about their utility for management. So the model I'll show you now, in terms of those options on the previous slide, has a temperature effect on movement of adults between adjacent patches, or in other words, migration, and it has a stochastic recruitment process. It doesn't have some of these other features turned on, but I'll show you some other models at the end. Next slide. So in response to this first research question, can we forecast changes in species distributions? On the next slide, I'm going to show you one of the main statistics we've been trying to forecast, which is the weighted center or centroid of the species range. Next slide. Brandon, will you go to the next one?
I'm trying.
Sorry, didn't mean to rush you. Thank you. So this will take a minute to unpack. The plot on the right is showing you the forecast year on the x-axis. So that's how far in the future we are from the last data point that the model actually, quote, saw. And on the y-axis is latitude, like on the map. So further up on the plot is further north. The red dots are where the range center actually went during these years. You can see that it mostly hung out between 38 and 39 degrees north, but it varied a lot. It did not all march north to the points we've made earlier. And And this also does not map on well to local temperature change. Summer flounder did not shift significantly north during the 2 heat wave years in our testing decade, which is, I think, highlighting how important it is to develop models that have processes in them that aren't just temperature. So in this model, the black line is the model's best guess as to where the range center was. And then the ribbons represent kind of a probability distribution. This is set up as a Bayesian hierarchical model, which we did so that we can communicate to you not only the best estimate of the model, but also an accurate quantification of uncertainty. And you can see that all of the red dots, even if they don't fall directly on the black line, fall somewhere in these blue bands, representing that some model runs did say that's where the range center was. It just wasn't the model's most likely guess. Next slide. I promised I'd show you several models, and I'm sorry that these are a little small, but I wanted to walk you through the types of model comparison that we've been doing. This now shows you on the top left a model with no temperature effect. And as you can see, when there's no temperature effect, the population dynamics just kind of run forward. It's not really estimating much of a shift at all. The wobbles up and down have to do with the effect of fishing on abundance, and therefore the effect of abundance on the species distribution. But the other 3 panels show you are different temperature models. The one that probably fits the data the best is the temperature dependent movement model in the top right. So in that model, we say that temperature affects the rate at which adult summer flounder move between these patches. But the temperature dependent recruitment model, which is in the bottom left, also encompasses most of the data points in the probability distribution of the model. Temperature dependent mortality model on the right doesn't do quite as well. Next slide. Another advantage of this modeling approach, in addition to just can it forecast the species range, is that because we're sort of jointly forecasting abundance and distribution, we can ask more nuanced questions that are based on management about what the abundance is doing over time. And this is an example of one type of question we thought might be of interest, which is how well can we forecast how much of the summer flounder stock is in the Mid-Atlantic Bight versus north in the Gulf of Maine or Georges Bank. And 100% of the stock is in the Mid-Atlantic Bight. So that's the red dots. That is, still the case. The stock has not shifted that far north yet. The model guesses that that percentage is closer to 95%. Still a fairly good guess. Again, this plot is here mostly to stimulate a conversation about what types of information like this would be most relevant to future management. Is it helpful to have these kind of specific boundary estimates of where abundance will be in the future? Are there other geographical features or time, kind of events in time that are specific things that these models could help forecast? Next slide. And this slide is a little bit hard to unpack, but I'm including it to show kind of where these models are really intended to have strength, which is in this spatial forecast of abundance. Now the number labels on each of these plots is the latitude band. On the x-axis, you still have time, but now on the y-axis, you have abundance. And you can see that in each of these plots, the model does an okay job, depending on the plot, of predicting the actual number of fish in that latitude band every year. And that's really what we want it to do, because in this approach where we're modeling population dynamics and the fishing effect, we want the range shift to kind of emerge because we accurately captured how abundance was changing at a local scale and how individuals were being exchanged between those populations. So we can zoom in on one of these plots in the next slide and see the type of behavior I'm talking about. This is just the 37° north patch. The red dots are what actually happened to abundance of summer flounder in this patch in the testing decade. And the blue ribbon, again, is showing what the model thinks actually happened. We don't get the exact magnitude totally right, and that's okay. This is not a stock assessment. Like Malin said, we're not really focused on estimating absolute abundance, but we are really interested in understanding relative abundance change, both between years and across space, to get at range change. And here you can see the model actually captures that quite well in forecasting these little ups and downs of the population, which emerged probably from a combination of a temperature effect and fishing and population dynamics. Next slide. So this kind of brings it all together, and I'd like to show this slide last because it doesn't have those uncertainty bands. So you might, if I show this first, think this was our most confident estimate, when in fact, this Bayesian approach lets us give a range of probable estimates that we can use to have conversations about uncertainty. But on the left, I'm showing you time is still on the x-axis, the testing decade, and latitudes on the y-axis. But now we're looking at abundance over space and time. So each vertical stripe, imagine you were flying over the East Coast, looking down, and the places with a lot of summer flounder were lighting up brightly. So the bright patches are high in abundance. And on the left, you see what we're trying to forecast, which gives you a sense of the scale of the challenge. You know, how on earth would a model guess that in 38 degrees north, you really had a lot of fish in 2009, but then in 2014, you had a ton of fish at 37 degrees north. The one on the right is one of the model best guesses. And you can see that it generally captures a lot of the pattern. It does capture that there was an overall increase in summer flounder abundance over time. It gets that there's very little summer flounder in the northern part of the survey, basically zero. And it gets that it's mostly concentrated kind of between 37 and 40 degrees north. Next slide. So I'll briefly address the other research questions, although we've kind of answered them in the process. So the question about timescales, if you go ahead one slide, many of these forecasts, and you might have noticed this when we were looking at these plots throughout the talk, get much more uncertain as we go into the future. And that's a characteristic of forecasts. When you go further and further away from the last data point, they just are less and less confident, which is a good thing because it tells us that there's more uncertainty in the model. So this plot on the bottom is kind of an example of what that looks like as we go further out from the starting point. But the models do have skill, depending on the model, for up to the full 10 years of the testing decade. Next slide. And we also wanted to explore, when we started this project, how much fishing pressure helped improve these forecasts. It turns out it really does. I didn't actually show you any models of summer flounder without a fishing effect because they don't perform nearly as well. So that seems to be an important ingredient in these kind of linked abundance distribution models. Next slide. So this is my last slide, just to give you a sense of what happens next and where we're at. The model has been programmed, and we're in the process of running summer flounder through all of these combinations of the different temperature effect models on mortality and recruitment and adult movement, as well as some of these other model features that we discussed. We're also statistically kind of formally comparing those to other species distribution modeling approaches. And the next thing in the pipeline, of course, is to do this for the other 3 species. I think that is the end of my section of the presentation, so I will pause here and hand it back over to Brandon.
Great. Thanks, Alexa. All right. So what does all of this mean? So again, a big focus of what we were trying to accomplish with this research was not only, developing these forecasting models, but thinking about its practical application within management. And so the research team really tried to think about where we could feed this kind of information within the council's management and science programs. And so I'm going to step through a few examples here and then give you the feedback that we've received from the EOP committee, AP, and the SSC, and then we'll have a discussion about where you all think we should go with this. And so one of the comments, or one of the points I did want to make, that even though I'm providing a number of different examples here, it doesn't necessarily have to apply across all of our species. We could utilize this information differently for our different species. And even if we apply it within a sort of an EAFM context, for example, we could still apply it differently to different species within the same sort of approach. So there's really no one size fits all in terms of how we could utilize this information for any of our council managed species. And so starting off sort of at a higher level, certainly, there are examples of where this information could be utilized by the council. Certainly it's within our current strategic plan, we talk a lot about sort of ecosystem factors and looking at distribution shifts and how we can sort of adapt to those changes and how we can respond to those. So understanding what those changes might look like and how management might want to respond addresses specific areas and strategies within our strategic plan. I already noted in the beginning of the presentation a lot of policies and strategies and research priorities we identified through our EAFM guidance document. So certainly we could account for those there, but very specifically within our EAFM risk assessment, we have very specific risk elements that look at climate change, that look at distribution shifts. There are other elements in there such as habitat changes and stock productivity, where this particular type of information could help inform our risk assessment. And we are going through a comprehensive review of our risk assessment this year. So thinking about future science that could help inform the risk assessment as we continue to move forward. There are a lot of different other management applications in terms of thinking about dynamic allocation strategies. So as you all know, you recently approved changes to the commercial state allocations for black sea bass, and part of the allocations utilize stock distribution information. So this is a potential application there. Many of you have been engaged in our East Coast climate change scenario planning project, and clearly a focus of that is distribution changes. And as we begin to move into the monitoring phase of that particular project, this is science that could help inform and evaluate the outcomes that may come out of the summit that was held a couple months ago, and thinking about sort of adaptive governance and management. So there's some application there. Certainly when we think about marine spatial planning, such as offshore wind siting or aquaculture development, thinking about what might be the spatial overlap between those areas and where species may be moving and where the fisheries may be targeting things. And then within NOAA Climate Ready Fisheries Management, this is something we've thought about, I've thought about a lot in terms of how we as the council can implement some of the climate ready fisheries management strategies that are there. And within that particular tool, they identify being able to develop forecast skills for thinking about changes in stock distributions. And certainly this feeds right into being more adaptive and sort of informing future management actions. There's a number of potential science applications, and I won't get into this in detail because Dr. Rago is going to give us the SSC's input on this. And Dr. Gates just tomorrow is going to talk about our State of the Ecosystem report. And I just wanted to let you all know that we've been thinking about the science applications of this research project as well. And as you hear Dr. Gates' report tomorrow on the State of the Ecosystem, think about how this type of information could help support the State of the Ecosystem information that you're getting as well. So with that, as Malin and Alexa noted, we've engaged with the EOP committee and AP throughout the project. We had our first meeting when we were starting this research project back in the end of 2019. We had a check-in early in 2022, and then we just presented to the committee and AP on February 23rd. So this is just a summary of the feedback that we've received. There's more detail in the briefing book in regards to some more specific comments that the AP and committee have provided. But here's some of the feedback that we got specifically to the dynamic range model. So there was a lot of sort of feedback that the research team should be connecting and sharing ideas and data information with other research groups that are working on some of the other target species. And so we have done that. Again, we're not quite ready for those other 3 species, but we are starting to make those connections. We're meeting with some of the squid folks. I think later this month, I think, is when we have a meeting to start making some of those connections, start talking about what we're doing with this project and what might be going on with some of the other research that's going on. Folks had, identified some potential limitations utilizing the center's bottom trawl survey from a number of different perspectives in regards to the trawl survey doesn't, survey the entire, range of a particular species, or the survey, given changes in migration patterns, may not be picking up species appropriately. So thinking about those data issues, thinking about other data sources that might be available to help inform the model. And some other concerns or recommendations we heard about is that the model forecasts need to not only incorporate and respond to changes in warming temperatures, but also be thinking about cooler, colder temperatures as well. And I think as Alexa had responded to, the model right now is we are not just indicating that models are, or that we are predicting warmer waters. The model that they've created allows us to see how summer flounder changes in either direction. So we're not forcing an automatically a warmer sort of climate on this. This is how summer flounder responds to changes in temperature, warmer or colder. So that's on the model. Feedback that we've received in regards to how we could utilize this information in science and management. Again, a committee recommendation was making sure that this bidirectional temperature function is considered in the modeling framework. The committee felt that this was really important if it was to have any management application, that we weren't just thinking about a warmer climate, but also, how species may be responding to changes in temperature in either direction. Making sure that we consider the development of these models for South Atlantic stocks so that our council can begin to prepare for future availability of any stocks from the South Atlantic. So we'll see how model results for a great triggerfish start, but thinking about some other species we may want to model this for in the future as well. A number of folks on the call expressed concern about the application of this project in any sort of management application, particularly for ILIX. There was a lot of concern about utilizing this for ILIX or for any spatial management considerations. And others had mentioned that additional work on both the model and refinement on the model is needed before we use any of this information going forward. Others on the call thought that this information is really needed in management and identified some very specific areas we could utilize it, which is within the EAFM risk assessment, or this topic came up during the scenario planning project, looking at the sensitivity of the leading and trailing edges of stocks as stocks are beginning to move in or move out of locations, looking at those trailing or leading ending of stocks and how sensitive they are. So that's the feedback we've received from the committee. And I will turn it over to Dr. Rago for input from the SSC.
Okay, thank you, Brandon. Appreciate it. Can you hear me?
We got you.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I have three short slides here, or 3 slides anyhow. The first of which is some general comments. The second addresses some terms of reference that we have, which are the potential applications and then research applications. Or research recommendations. So the first is we were overall encouraged and impressed by the quality of the work. We are encouraged continued development and also recommended some additional validation using simpler methods such as statistical models or geospatial approaches. We encouraged, the bullet 3 there is we encouraged some further consideration of survey sampling issues. These include things like small area estimation and the post hoc partitioning of survey strata. That would be in the area of what's called domain estimation approaches or post stratification. We were impressed by the good correspondence between the predictions, the retrospective predictions for the period 2007 to 16 from the bottom trawl survey. And as several have noted, Alexa and Malin as well, these predictions increase with the length of the forecast. So that's an important consideration. And then also, as emphasized earlier, true forecasts are going to require forecast of oceanographic conditions on similar timescales. So that will be an important adjunct to this ongoing research effort. Next slide, please. Here we had 2 terms of reference, the first of which is to comment on potential applications. The first, we noted that the state of the ecosystem indicators vulnerability for coastal communities and these various social and economic metrics would be a valuable, a potential area for application. And we thought that there may be some utility in terms of looking at fishing performance under various harvest control rules. So that certainly is something where information of this sort could complement some of the mechanisms that are already incorporated into some of the harvest control rule methodologies. The terms of retrospectively evaluating catch advice. This could be another area. So that's what the feasibility of catch advice relative to historical distributions. Did we get it right, or how did changing spatial patterns influence what had been previously implemented? There, as noted, there are some potential allocation decisions that could be based on some of these forecasts, or at least supported in terms of contemporary patterns. And then one potential link that has not been mentioned yet is in terms of the retrospective patterns or retrospective bias that occurs in stock assessments in some instances where it is difficult to interpret what the underlying signal might be. Some process has changed. This one gives you some insights into something like, say, survey catchability, where the stock may be moving. And then finally, depending on how the model is ultimately parameterized, there may be some value in terms of evaluating offshore wind energy impacts. So the next slide describes the research recommendations we had. The first of which is that the thermal preference of fish changes as fish age. Older fish generally prefer deeper water. So that means that the gradients that exist on latitudinal bins, as the patches as presently structured in there, also have very strong thermal gradients within them as you move from inshore to offshore. So that would be an important factor to perhaps start to consider. And that leads to the second point, which is that the alternative patterns of spatial binning might be possible, and that would allow for the inshore-offshore depth-related thermal responses that could also be important not only for the population distribution, but also for the concentration of fish and their vulnerability to harvesting. We noted that in particular that there have been changes over time in the timing, the start and end dates, the duration of the surveys, the execution of the surveys. By that I mean there's gear, door, and vessel changes over time, and then particularly with the transition to the Bigelow was the elimination of some of the inshore strata that are now covered under the NEOMAP survey. So again, other sort of the nuances of the survey data handling are important to check out. We felt that this serves as a useful tool for checking the confounding influences of trends, and allowing us to maybe isolate to some extent the trends that are due to both fishing and then due to climatic warming and the changes. Again, the recommendation was to consider some simpler methods to confirm these trends. I think that would be valuable. And then finally, that there may be some utility in terms of looking at the spring bottom trawl survey as well as the fall survey. So collectively, I think we were encouraged and impressed by the work that was done, and recommended additional research. So thank you.
Great, thank you, Paul. Just 2 more slides, and then we'll open it up for questions and discussion. So I won't go through all of these questions, but here are some questions for you all to be thinking about as we have our discussion. One is in regards to the potential management application. So if you were given this information on some sort of routine basis in the future for whatever stock it might be, how would you utilize that information? Is this kind of information useful to you? And if so, what are the types of actions and priorities or projects that you think the council would utilize this kind of information for? So that's thinking about how you all would utilize and take this information and use it for whatever sort of decisions or actions that you're considering. And then as we've identified, we're not quite done with things, right? So we need to get to actual forecasting. So there is work to be done. And so where do you think, what sort of feedback do you have in regards to future model development, in regards to, is there other information that you all think we should be producing? Are there different model outputs that you would like to see? Are there other species that we should be thinking about? Is there other, sort of directions that we should be taking this research? Because that will help us, help inform us as the project, and the research team thinking about how we want to get these models set up, what kinds of outputs we can produce for you. So with that, you've heard a lot about what we think and what the EOP and SSC think about potential applications. So we want to get that from, where you all think we can utilize this information. So we're really looking for 2 applications here. Again, we still have work to do. We still need to apply it to the other 3 target species that we have here. And we need to get to a phase where we're actually doing forecasting skills. That's going to require additional efforts beyond just this research project. We're going to need oceanographic forecasting and those types of things to fit into this modeling framework. But where should we take that sort of research if you find this, information really valuable? So just wanted to thank you for your time. And with that, I'll take questions, or the research team will take questions, and then looking for discussion and feedback from you all.
Okay, thanks, Brendan. And let me first thank Dr. Pinsky, Dr. Fredston, and Dr. Rago for participating with us today and providing us the information for our discussion. Before we get to that, I do want to make one announcement. John Maniscalco, it will be sitting in with us this week as a member of the council as a proxy for Maureen Davidson. John is participating virtually, and I just wanted to welcome him. So welcome, John. Thank you. Okay, with that said, let's go ahead and see if anyone has any comments they'd like to, or let's start with questions. Does anyone have any questions for the research team or for Brandon directly? Mike Pentney?
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, this is great stuff, and I think potentially really powerful for the council, moving forward and understanding what might be happening and how we can potentially adapt management. I guess one question I have sort of stems from, it seems like the central metric that we're tracking is the centroid of the distribution of the biomass, and that makes sense for a lot of reasons. But I can sort of imagine 3 scenarios where in all 3 scenarios, the centroid might move north and east, but what's actually happening in the stock might be very different. So you could have a stock where the southern boundary remains constant, but or even is moving a little bit south, but predominantly the stock is expanding north and east, and that would kind of indicate that you'd see a centroid movement. Or you could have a stock where the entire distribution is shifting, both the southern and northern boundaries are kind of shifting north and east. Or you could have another stock where the northern boundary remains somewhat constant, but the southern boundary is sort of collapsing out from under the stock. All 3 cases, you might see in a simple metric, you'd see the centroid move north and east, but the management response that we might want to pursue could be very different in each of those 3 scenarios. So I'm just curious if you thought about that, or if there's a way to adapt the model to kind of reflect what's happening at the larger scale for the overall distribution. And then I think, just follow up and I'll be done. I think your last slide, Brandon, suggested, future uses. I think the next discussion we're going to have is going to be on scenario planning, and we don't yet have a final report from the scenario planning work that was done over the last couple of years. But I think as the council and councils start to really dig into the results of the scenario planning work and think about what the next steps are in response to that work, I think this model and these efforts, I think, could play an important part in providing the information that the councils need. Thanks.
Okay, thanks for those questions and comments. Mike, any response? Brandon?
Yeah, I'll start and then I'll turn it over to Malin and Alexa that have a much better understanding. So I agree. I think our model has the ability to tease out some of those differences. I mean, I think we were showing the centroid. It's a sort of common sort of output that I think most people are familiar with. That's what we've generally have shown for changes in stock distribution has been the centroid of the population. But I think we have the ability to show changes within. I mean, right now the scale is at these latitudinal bins that we're showing, but so I think we have the ability to look at what are those changes within bins. So what the abundance is within there and how those might be changing. I think there are different ways that we can present the data, Mike, that might be more informative than just beyond the sort of centroid. That's what we were trying to get at. Like, what is the way we could present the information to you? What's the kind of information you think would be most useful beyond the centroid information? But Malin, Alexa, you have any additional thoughts?
It's exactly right, Brandon and Mike. I will emphasize what Brandon said, just that there's a lot more going on with the model than just the centroid. We showed, a few other metrics that we've considered, and we love other ideas. One is just the proportion of the stock in any defined area, like the Mid-Atlantic Bight could be one. Alexa talked about that slide. Another option would be just relative abundance across the latitudinal bands, at least as the model is set up right now. We could also, you mentioned edge dynamics, which I agree are really important. We've done a lot of work, a lot of research on edge dynamics. Alexa's led quite a bit of that. But we could, at least in a coarse way, output edge positions or sort of estimates of where the core of a stock would be. So there are, because it is a full spatial population dynamic model underneath, we can pull out different summaries that would be useful for the council in their decision making. If you want to add anything, Alexa.
No, I think that's exactly right. And it's worth pointing out that some models may be better at predicting some of these metrics and some may be better at predicting others. So if some of the feedback is that it's particularly important to be able to predict range edge dynamics because that's when species really shift in and out of management boundaries, we can prioritize the way that we select the best models among the ones that we're testing to perform really well at those metrics versus a metric like that position of a centroid.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions for the team? Dewey Hemmelwright.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the presentation. And I may have missed this, but when you're developing a model of the distribution, how are you getting the data where the fish are caught at that informs the model, or is that not the case? Is it from a survey? Is it from BTR catch reporting? Is it from observer work? So I'm trying to get the understanding, if somebody fishes in a particular area, how does the model get informed of where the biomass is relative to the total distribution? Is it making sense what I'm asking the question of, Brandon?
Yes, to me it makes sense. I don't know if I'm the most I'm the right person to answer it, but I mean the survey, the trawl survey is what we're utilizing as sort of our abundance piece. I don't know, we are including fishing effects, and Alexa, maybe you can speak to that. Like, so how is, the fishing effect sort of included in that? Like how is that being modeled and accounting for, which is maybe what Dewey you're trying to get at, is how is stock abundance and sort of fishing pressures, how are they informing one another? Is that?
Yeah, I was, maybe I should have been paying better attention that this model is informed from the survey. And so that's just one part of it. Survey's one part, but also dependent fishing is another part. And I was just wondering how them two jive together. Even though you got a survey, surveys can do different things, different times of the year, and different conditions. And so I'm just curious as to the aspect of the fishing part, the dependent part is how that fits into the model that goes along with the survey. And is there any variance between that once it's into the model? You know, models to me look like the more information that you're able to put into something is a possibility to better inform you. And I like to see, even though it looks promising, I like to see a clear landscape picture, not as it's getting painted, because I don't have that foresight. I like to see the, you know, the trees and the bushes and everything else out there. So that's why I asked that, you know, what else is going to inform the model? Or is this going to be basically just a survey type of thing that's going to continue to inform? Is there any catch data analysis or catch something that's, you know, BTR is a little bit different than a survey, because survey is probably more precise of where something is written down at than a BTR. And I'm just wondering if any type of fishery dependent data is going to be used to be informed or help with the model. Thank you. Sorry for being long.
I'll kick that off to either to Malin or Alexa.
Thanks for that question. So right now we're using information on spatial distribution from the survey, as Brandon mentioned. We're also pulling some of the output from the stock assessment, especially the information on fishing mortality through time and how that varies across the years. Anything else you want to add, Alexa?
No, I think that's a great summary.
Dr. Hare?
Thank you very much, and Malin and Alexa and Brandon, thank you very much for the excellent talk. If I may just help sort of clarify it, if I understand correctly, you're using sort of the spatial information from the survey and then assuming uniform fishing mortality over the range. Is that correct?
That's correct. And if we had spatially explicit fishing mortality information, we could use it, but we've just been using the F estimates from the stock assessment, which are obviously region-wide.
Right, so to Dewey's question, there is no spatial component of fishing mortality. It's just taking the F from the stock assessment and applying that over the whole model range.
That's right.
Okay. Thank you for the clarification.
Dewey?
So that helps me understand a little more, but basically the fishing effort, or F, it's different throughout the range. It's not spread out the same over the distribution of the latitudes and things. So, you know, that's something that because it's just not the case, that there's fishing effort that's taking place in different areas more so than others that give you your, you know, stuff in the stock assessment, your F. So I was just curious about that. Is that going to be tuned up in the future to do better distribution of where the fish are caught at and the different, you know, fleets where they operate at versus what's happening now? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Dewey, and thanks, John, for clarifying. Because I agree. I mean, that would be a really interesting direction to go. I think it would definitely take some work to pull VTR or other similar data sets together so that we could get a better spatial estimate of F. I mean, that may be its own project in some ways to put together those spatial F estimates through time in the mid-Atlantic. And that would be but that would be very helpful for these kinds of models, especially for understanding whether changes in the spatial distribution of F contribute to some of the observed spatial changes in the stocks.
Okay, thanks for that, Malin. Thanks for the question, Dewey. I'm going to go next to Chairman Reed.
Mr. Chairman, thank you to the three doctors and to you. So I'm looking at the area, generally speaking, north of 41 north and west of 72 west. I mean, your model doesn't even have to perform there because there's land there. It's the first thing, there's land. So you don't have to worry about it. But in the area from 40 north to 41 north, a species can move a mile or so north or south, but it can move 250 or 300 miles east. So my direction to you would be east. That would be my direction. I don't know how you account for latitude, longitude. I didn't see that in the model, but Mr. Penny and Dr. Rago also referenced latitude. I really think the further east you look, the better off the information is going to be, especially when you get out to the southern edge of the shallower part of Georges Bank. For fluke especially, there's a lot of fluke out there. And those fish have been there for a very long time, but that biomass, without accounting for that particular portion of that biomass, you're not getting the epicenter of the world in the fluke world, I suppose. So how are you going to account for longitude? I guess that's my question. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that question. In the current iteration of the model, we've, especially as we're in this testing phase and trying to understand how these process-based models work, we've focused on the latitudinal component of it. But as you point out, the coastline is not directly north-south, and there are key places where longitude really matters, and depth really matters. So it's a really interesting direction to continue developing. We have a prototype model running for a different project that does involve a grid. So it's gridded both latitude and longitude. So that may be a direction to go in the future.
Okay, thanks. And Eric, thanks for raising your hand online. It's a lot harder for me to miss you waving down from the end of the table when it's waving at me on my computer screen. So appreciate that. I see that one. That was his thumb, by the way. I sometimes get something else, but I got a thumb raise that time. Okay, next, I have Pat Gear. Pat.
I agree with what Eric was saying. I think we need to also look at the east-west after the depth. The question I have is, have you presented this to the other councils yet, especially comments they may be having?
The chairman just offered New England Council's comments. No, we haven't. I mean, we've, and after Eric's comments, I think we have enough from New England. So, I think we've been focused on getting the feedback from the ecosystem committee and AP and from you all first, and getting a sense of whether or not you think this kind of information is useful and that we should continue to develop this kind of work, and where you see potential application in this. Certainly, I think there's relevance to all of the councils along the Atlantic coast potentially, right, in this kind of work. As we've talked about with scenario planning, I've talked to the South Atlantic Council staff, quite a bit about this project, as we've thought about the species we might want to be modeling and thinking about that. So I've talked to them at a staff level, but not in terms of any sort of presentations to them.
All right, thanks for that. Peter Hughes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, everybody. Great presentation. And I'm looking forward to the continued build out of it. So in the slide where you're speaking about summer flounder, and you've got the yellow squiggly line going through that, and then you enter into the model what it's predicting into the future, and it gave you a line that was relatively correspondent to what was going on with the data inputs that were in the model. I mean, is there any comparison yet? I think it's pretty early, but is there any comparison yet with landings or effort to lend some validity to the model, and that, okay, it does actually kind of correspond with landings, what the model is seeing, because, you know, our landings spike and go up and down and ebb and flow on an annual basis. So I was wondering if there was any work, you know, you're kind of looking at it retrospectively and looking at it again retrospectively, taking into consideration landing.
I'll let Malin and Alexa answer, but we have not done that, Peter. You know, at least to my knowledge, we haven't. You know, I think we've, the SSC, part of their recommendations were, and I know Alexa has talked to other, and we want to do some analyses to other sort of spatial models to compare how this modeling approach compares to other models that do sort of distribution, you know, modeling work. But you know, the SSC had recommended doing some evaluations to maybe more simpler approaches, and maybe there are ways we could evaluate landings and catch information as different components of that. But I don't, to my knowledge, we haven't sort of done that sort of evaluation of what we're doing here to other modeling approaches or other data components that we could evaluate sort of what our outputs are versus what else is going on.
Yeah, thanks, Brandon, and thanks for the question, Peter. As Brandon said, we haven't compared against landings. We've been doing the comparison against the bottom trawl survey. It's at least from the perspective of understanding the spatial distribution of the species. The bottom trawl survey is really helpful and really nice because it covers such a wide range, because it's in this stratified, it has this stratified random survey design. So from the perspective of what the model is trying to forecast, I think the bottom trawl survey is one of our best data sources. We've done a bunch of other work, and others in the research community have as well, comparing landings to spatial distribution just from the bottom trawl surveys. And, you know, as you probably are well aware, landings don't always follow exactly where the species are. You know, there are economic factors, there are practical considerations about travel time, boat size, boat operations, regulations, all of those other layers modify where landings happen, when and where they spike, in addition to the question of where the fish are.
All right, thank you for that. John Hare, and then Chris Bat-Savage after John. Go ahead, John.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I learned to use my computer reminder. Yeah, Malin and, you know, and Alexa and Brandon, thank you very much for the presentation. Very interesting and, you know, I think potentially useful modeling. I'll send some specific comments along. But just 3 points to make. One, you know, this idea that we'll need environmental forecasts to have this be useful for looking in the future. That's what the Climate Ecosystem Fisheries Initiative is designed to do. This effort is looking at sort of 1 to 10 year forecast, and that's the time scale that Climate Ecosystem Fisheries Initiative is going to target. So there is, you know, very likely those environmental forecasts will start being generated in the next year or two. Second point is, and I think that came up in the SSC review, this idea of, you know, you're looking at summer flounder, the example that you gave, you know, that each fall is connected to the prior fall. But the SSC recommended also including spring or thinking about sort of the annual cycle. You know, the Mid-Atlantic has one of the greatest seasonal cycles in the world. And so, you know, where summer flounder are in next fall, the combination of conditions next fall and conditions between now and the fall. And so I think of it as like, I see in some of these distribution work, there's memory in the system. You know, species go north and then they come south, and they go north and they come south, and how far north they go in one year is dependent on how far south they go in the winter. So trying to think about, how you could incorporate that sort of that seasonal movement, that memory, could be a very useful way to look at it. And then to your question, Eric, and the SSC's question about latitude, one way to do that would be to do the survey strata, because the survey strata are structured sort of along that northeast sort of rotating trajectory. And then, Malin, you mentioned that you've got more of a grid type. I think that would also be very effective. In some of the studies, they've used in a long shelf and cross shelf grid, which is, it's basically a curvilinear grid. So you'd look at the distance along the shelf, which, is initially north-south and then becomes east-west. So I think you're on the right track there. And I think there's, examples that you could use to help you improve the model that way. But thank you very much for the presentation. Enjoyed it very much and look forward to continuing to see the work move forward.
Hey, thanks, John. Chris Batsavage and Dan Farnham. Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess I probably have more thoughts on the applications and questions that Brandon has for the council as far as next steps. So I can just wait in the queue if people still have questions on that, or if those can get put up on the screen so I can remember what you were asking for feedback on. But I guess talking while doing that, just kind of thinking about how we could use this, and the point Eric made about kind of the longitudinal movement of fish, or in this case, summer flounder, I think is maybe useful from a management perspective on when the fish are in certain areas, and thinking about summer flounder moving inshore in the spring, if the water temperatures are warmer earlier in the spring, they may start moving inshore earlier in the spring, which means then they're available to probably mostly recreational fishermen and commercial fishermen to a certain extent. So, trying to set management measures recreationally and commercially, I think need to be considered, future considerations for where these fish are now versus where they were 5 years ago. It may not be the fish are necessarily, shifting north. They're just in places earlier and staying later. In the case of summer flounder and in other species like Spanish mackerel, which they've been in North Carolina for forever, but they're now showing up in March instead of May. That definitely can have some management implications. I know the bottom trawl survey is a very comprehensive and long time series for tracking species movement, but we know that some of the species that are moving around in the ocean aren't necessarily susceptible to the trawl survey, not the gear itself, and also where and when it fishes. So I think we need to think about what we're going to use if we're interested in tracking the movement of any species, especially these pelagic fish like Spanish mackerel, cobia, things like that, that really weren't in the mid-Atlantic in big numbers 10, 20, 30 years ago, but are certainly showing up more now, and that will impact management. And not giving answers, just kind of some kind of general thoughts as far as what we heard today and what we need, I guess, maybe what the council, how we could use it and think about in the future as we deal with things moving around in places and times that they didn't in the past.
Yeah, thank you, Chris, for that. And yeah, I think you helped segue us into the discussion, although some of the speakers prior to you kind of did the same thing through questions. It was kind of like having Rob O'Reilly here again, with comments coming out of questions, but it's all good. I'm hoping that Brandon and the team are getting the feedback that they need. So I think I'll open the door now for any comments regarding what you see before you as far as value of the application for this for management and any future considerations with model development. I'm going to go next to Dan Farnham. Go ahead, Dan.
Yep. Thank you, Mr. Chair. To that point, and going back to a comment Mike had made earlier, as the spatial distribution changes or the habitat changes for each species, and you have an expanding range in the northern area and eastern area, but a stagnant line in the southern area, should a different biomass level, a target level, be more appropriate to look at as a distribution or the habitat gets larger or smaller? So I don't know if that's come up in conversation, but it's pertinent to the presentation. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Dan. Maybe that can be posed to the team. Has anything like that been part of the discussions?
Brandon, do you want me to jump in or did you have some thoughts?
Yeah, no, go ahead, Malin. I mean, I have some thoughts, but you go first.
Yeah, I mean, my first thought is that, we're really focused on spatial distribution questions, not reference points and not trying to take the place of a stock assessment. So I'm a little hesitant to sort of wade into those kinds of questions. It seems like this, I don't know if I'd use this model necessarily. With that, I'd have to think a little bit more on it.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say something similar. I mean, that's not exactly what the intent of this model was, but I think where I think this could be informative is, again, I think there are some science applications, and maybe if through this modeling effort we are seeing some sort of unique changes to how the distribution is being changed, maybe that could help inform, or at least when the stock assessment is going on, they could take a look at some dynamics that might be going on, so I think maybe they could help inform one another potentially, right? So, our intent here, as Malin said, was not to change what our target reference point should be or target biomass should be. We're just trying to understand how the stock may be moving at these shorter time scales. But I think there's the potential for the information to help inform each other, right? How can this kind of information, how can climate information be used to inform our stock assessments? And so maybe it's something that our stock assessment folks could be thinking about as they're diving into that.
Yeah, and I guess along those lines, it may, if habitat, it seems like is, suitable habitat is expanding, and it looks like from the stock assessment that productivity is going up. Maybe these models could provide some sort of corroborating evidence for a mechanism that might explain the kinds of results that are coming out of the stock assessment.
Okay, thank you both for helping with that question. Before I turn to the audience for any comments or questions regarding the presentation, I'll ask one last time, is there any member around the table, anyone from the council that would like to offer any thoughts regarding value or future development considerations? Michelle Duval.
No, just thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just really quick, I appreciated the SSC's input, and I think one thing that really resonated with me was, potentially assisting with, survey redesign or adjustment if, we think that critters are leaving an area, and I think that could be particularly useful as we think about the outputs from the climate change scenario planning, where we talked a lot about the science that would be needed, Sure. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Michelle. Anyone else from the council? Okay, seeing none at this time, I'm going to go ahead and turn to the public. I have 3 members in the audience. I'm going to take them first, and then I'll go online. If you are participating virtually, if you can raise your hand, it should come to the top of my screen, and I'll call on you after we hear from the 3 members that are in the audience here today. I'm going to start with Greg DiDomenico. James Fletcher, you're next.
Greg DiDomenico, Lund's Fisheries. Mr. Chairman, if you could, I've got I think one question for Brandon, one for Dr. Fredstone, one for Dr. Hare, and one for Dr. Rago, if that's okay. Try to be as quick as possible.
That's fine, Greg. It's Fredston.
It's what?
Fredston.
Fredston. What did I say?
Flintstone, I think you said.
Fredstone. God, my apologies for that. Dr. Fredston, could you go back to your centroid slide, please? And if you can't, it's not a big deal. I want to continue with what Dewey was saying. I realize that you're using the trawl survey. Do you use any of the state surveys? Do you use NEMAP surveys?
Greg, this is Malin. Alexa had to sign off, I think, because she had to go teach, actually. So I can take this first question. So in this first pilot run, and as we get the model up and developing, we're just focused on the bottom trawl survey out of Woods Hole. We're definitely aware of the NEMAP survey. We've used it in other projects, and those data sources can definitely be helpful. Just based on what we've done in other projects, I don't expect it would dramatically change the results that we're showing you here, but yeah.
Okay. Dr. Hare, is it possible to, do you think the Northeast Fisheries Trawl Survey is enough to provide conclusive evidence that there's a stock shift to the north and east or out of the mid-Atlantic?
Depends on the species. I think one of the challenges I see for the approach using the bottom trawl survey is, predict which species are going to come into the region. They're not already in the region. It's going to be, without having data, it's going to be hard to predict them coming in. And then species which are, as you mentioned, the NEMAP survey, species which are predominantly inshore of the footprint of the bottom trawl survey, it's going to be hard to do that. So in that category, I'd say weak fish would probably be a good example. And then species that are, sort of offshore of the footprint of the bottom trawl survey would similarly not be well captured in this type of analysis, but additional data. I think, again, to Malin's point, I think this is a proof of concept of dynamic range modeling used to inform management. So as the proof of concept moves forward, additional survey data, spatially explicit fishery data, the approach could be sort of added on to.
And John, certainly not now, although I'm sure you could find it relatively quickly. I know how many trawl survey spots, how many stations are there?
Generally, it's close to 360, but it varies.
Sure. And are fluke caught at the majority of those spots? And how many pounds do you think of fluke do we catch in the trawl survey a year?
I think fluke is probably one of the better covered species by the trawl survey. Mentioned before, there are species with a lot less coverage.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Is Dr. Rago still on?
Yes, I am.
I believe he is. Yep, there he is.
Yep, here.
Hello, Dr. Rago. It's Greg DiDomenico. How are you?
Hey, Greg. Good. Thanks.
I had a quick question for you. I'm looking at your the SSC's term of reference, March 7th, regarding this project. It says, number one, comment on potential applicability of short-term forecasts of species distribution for stock assessment, science, and management purposes of Mid-Atlantic species, period. Consider potential implications for the SSC's OFL-CV approach. If ELIX doesn't have an OFL, what potentially can we use this analysis for?
For ILEX in the immediate future, I think it's limited. We haven't, first of all, they haven't parameterized the model yet for that purpose. So of course that is one limitation. The second is this will be particularly challenging in the sense that the residency of ILEX on the shelf is rather of short duration. So the ability to characterize it by either the spring or the fall survey is a challenge because of that variable availability that occurs between years. And so forth.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, one last for staff. Brandon, I keep hearing words like dynamic allocation, spatial allocation, flexible landings, flexible management. Is there a species, or maybe rephrase that. I don't see a scenario that plays out under this analysis that benefits the industry, either probably, certainly commercial and perhaps recreational. I don't see any benefit to this except losing quota to fisheries to states to the north. Am I wrong?
Well, I mean, that's a really hard question to say in terms of how the council and the commission, depending upon the species, may apply sort of a spatial allocation approach going forward. I mean, the models the results that we've shown don't indicate that the stock is just going north, particularly over a shorter time period. So it depends, on how the council and the commission want to utilize sort of future changes in stock distribution to make allocation decisions. And it depends on what sort of timescales you would utilize that information for. But it shows clearly in the information for summer flounder that the stock is moving north and south in any particular year, right? So it doesn't mean, again, it's a hard question to, I mean, I understand what you're getting at, but it's not just showing that that, you know, quota should be leaving from New Jersey and going to Massachusetts. That's not what these models are directly saying, particularly under the timescales that you're evaluating this under. So I don't think by default that's what this modeling approach is showing you. More than anything, I think it's saying that maybe you wouldn't be doing that, right? That these allocations are much more dynamic. Fish are moving. There's a lot of variability, variability in regards to what's going on. But I think it all depends on how the information is used and how the council and board ultimately want to utilize spatial information to make allocation decisions.
Yeah, that was a great answer, Brandon. Thank you. I was going to say something very similar. You know, this information is knowledge. The management decision comes at it's at a different level. It's at the board level. It's at the council level. And using this would be basically using our best available information to make those decisions, whether they occur or not. So yeah, you said it much more eloquently than I just did, but so thanks for that. James Fletcher, and then Megan, I'll come back to you.
James Fletcher, United National Fishermen's Association. I was hoping that the ecosystem approach to fisheries management would be the same as New England's ecosystem-based fisheries management. We're using two different terms trying to get the same thing, and it's confusing to old people like me. Why can't the two councils use the same terminology? I discussed it with Dr. Moore, and there's a difference in the approach. But why can't we be developing the same line of thought? And what we're missing here is we have a perfect approach to fully utilize the resource. In the past, if you had a permit for one thing and caught something else and didn't have that permit, you had to discard it if you were on the commercial side. If you were recreational fishing and you caught something that was out of season, you had to discard it. Why can't we use whichever terminology to develop full utilization of the resource? And why can't, or I ask this question, can the models run the permits that the commercial fishermen have in North Carolina if the fish come from the south and they don't have the permits, they're going to be discarded. In New England, if they don't have the permits as the fish move whichever direction, they're discarded. Is it possible that this ecosystem-based fisheries management or the ecosystem approach to fisheries management can end up with 100% utilization of all catch? Is it possible that the models can run 100% utilization and tell us where we would be in production? Now, I've watched this and listened, and I see we think the fish are moving north, we think the fish are moving south. I asked the question, are the fish moving because the chemicals that we're putting in the water coming out of the rivers and sounds out of the Chesapeake Bay, where PFABs, which are plastics, are now the quote unquote thing? But I've asked the question for 20 years. Have the birth control pills, the man-made chemicals, are they affecting more the movement of the fish and the species than what we're doing? And can these models address the chemicals in the water? As I asked, my main thing is, can these models be used to prevent the waste of the resource, either by changing the permit system or going to full utilization or doing away with any closed season? But can these models show what would happen with the total resource? The United National Fishermen's Association thanks you.
Thanks, James. So Brandon, you did such a bang-up job with Greg's question. And there were a lot of different questions there, but any thought on the ability for these models to inform how we might minimize waste? Or does that fall on the management side of it rather than what the models are capable of?
I guess I have two thoughts. One, we've received a lot of feedback, for things that we want to think about for future model development, such as, including habitat components and those sorts of things to get a better understanding of the different drivers that might be influencing changes in stock distribution. Right now it's temperature and sort of the sort of general dispersal and fishing effort in terms of how those are driving changes in stock distribution. So are there other covariates we might want to be thinking about, such as habitat or such as changes to the chemicals in the water? We're going to need the information to support the models to do some of that work. But I think those are areas for future development to think about what are some of these other drivers that may be influencing changes in stock distribution. So that's an answer to one component. The other thing in regards to the permitting question, I think that's going to be, the model is not constructed now certainly to handle all of those things, but I think it can provide sort of the type of information to the council as the council's beginning to think about, if the council is thinking about some sort of management action to change out, permitting, or looking at how changes in, where we can provide sort of information on changes in stock distribution, and are we seeing changes in discarding rate, discarding rates in some of our fisheries, and what might be some of those drivers, looking at some of the, we've received a lot of sort of feedback to be thinking about fishing effort and sort of these spatial dynamics within fishing mortality. I think that kind of information could be informative. I think that's ultimately going to be a management decision in regards to how you all want to deal with minimizing discards and waste. But I think this information could maybe show like spatial overlap of how the fishery is responding to changes in stock distribution, and sort of help create the picture to say what might be driving changes in discards or something like that. But ultimately, I think it's going to be more of a management decision. But I think in time, this kind of information could be produced, from a modeling effort.
All right, thank you for that.
I can add on just one tiny bit, maybe.
I'm sorry.
I can add on a tiny bit to Brandon's answer if that's helpful.
Oh, sure. Sure. Go ahead, Mayor.
Sure. Okay, yeah, this is Malin. Just pointing out that the Northeast Climate Integrated Modeling Project, also called NCLIM, it's run by Lisa Kerr up at the Gulf of Maine Research Institute, is starting to include dynamic range models in management strategy evaluation, which may be one way forward for answering some of these, different goals that the council may want to achieve, around discards or other goals. And also just want to state clearly that at least all the scientific evidence right now points to temperature as one of the really large drivers explaining the shifts that we've seen. Other factors like include oxygen, prey, and habitat availability, but in this region, temperature really does seem very important.
Okay, thanks, Malin. Megan?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Megan Lapp, Seafreeze. I just wanted to reiterate some comments that I had at the committee, which actually, have kind of really been confirmed today by both Dr. Hare and Dr. Rago as far as spatial coverage. I have a lot of concerns about this model being used for ELEX, specifically because, to Dewey's point earlier, the model is based on the survey data, and the survey does not cover the spatial footprint of ELEX or the timing footprint of ELEX. ELEX were on the shelf in the summertime. The survey happens in the spring and the fall. It's not great coverage. And at the AP meeting, when this was discussed, I said, so if the survey indices, like, we don't have an accepted assessment because the species primarily lives in a range not covered by the survey. It primarily lives off the shelf. And its range goes all the way to Iceland. There's been a fishery in Newfoundland, Canada, since, at least the 60s. So, and the response was, well, we can use things like age length keys and stock recruit relationships, things like that, neither of which we don't have any of that for ELEX. So I have a lot of concerns about this model being used for ELEX because basically, like, there's no data to feed it. And whatever data that is sparse that does feed it, the rest of it's going to have to be based on assumptions. And that really does concern me because I think everybody in this room knows that a model is only as good as its assumptions. And if most of the data that's being fed is assumptions, I have a lot of concerns about that. So thank you.
Thank you for your comment, Megan. I appreciate it. It's nice to see you. Okay, anyone else from the audience? Is there anyone online? Okay, seeing no hands at this time and having not seen any come on my screen during the discussion, I'm going to ask Brandon and the research team. I think we had a robust discussion about, the use of this moving forward, and I think you got some good recommendations on ways to explore future development. Is there anything specific that you'd like the council to address at this point before we move on?
Nothing for me. No, I appreciate the discussion and the feedback. It's been really good. So thank you.
Yeah, and I'll just echo that. Thanks so much for the feedback. This has been really helpful, and look forward to continue working with many of you on this.
Yeah, thanks. And before we break, I got some a couple notes on my phone during the discussion about whether or not this presentation might be available at an upcoming Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission meeting. So just something to think about. I know you got the answer from Eric on the New England Council, but if ASMFC might benefit from hearing this as well. So I just want to put it out there. Okay, we're going to go ahead and thank you all for your participation and thank you for your presentation. We're going to break for a few minutes here and come back at 4 o'clock to wrap up the day with Kylie Dancy and the climate change scenario planning presentation. So come back at 4. Thank you. All right, if I can ask everybody to start to take their seats, we'll get started in about 2 minutes. All right, welcome back from the break, everyone. We have one more item on today's agenda, and it is a discussion which is going to be presented by Kylie Dancy with council staff. This is the East Coast Climate Change Scenario Planning Update. So I'm going to turn things over to Kylie to provide us with that presentation. It's all you, Kylie.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good to see you back and to see everyone else here today. So I have a brief update on the East Coast Climate Change Scenario Planning Initiative, and see if I can get this clicker to work. So the purpose of this discussion is mostly to focus on an update on the summit meeting that was held in February. And I will say this, the report from that summit meeting is not yet available. So this may be a little bit more of a brief update on the main themes and some of the potential actions that came up in the discussion at that meeting. And everything that I'm going to talk about today is sort of a preliminary outcome of that will be taken to the NRCC next month for discussion. So I also know many of you are on the table were at the summit meeting, so I apologize if some of this is a little redundant for you, but hopefully this is a good refresher. I'll also talk a little bit about next steps, including the NRCC meeting and beyond. And there's no council action needed on this today. We'll have a further discussion at another council meeting later in this year after those final reports are available and after the NRCC has discussed next steps. So just as a reminder, this has been a multi-year initiative starting mostly in 2021 with the orientation and scoping phases where we established objectives, reached out to stakeholders to gather input on forces of change driving fisheries over the next 20 years. We then further explored those drivers of change in 2022 in the exploration phase. We also held the scenario creation workshop last June, where we had a large group get together to build a scenario framework that was used to provide a platform for basically further discussions through the application phase, which is where we are now, and we're sort of at the end of that application phase. So that the application phase began last fall. You will remember a series of small group manager brainstorming sessions held last fall to sort of generate some preliminary ideas about actions and recommendations that might be useful under the various scenarios that we had created. And under uncertain future conditions. And then in November and December of last year, each of the participating management bodies had that workshop meeting during our meetings to further develop these ideas for the application phase. So the summit meeting that was held in February served as essentially the culmination of the application phase, and we are now sort of nearing completion of this initiative. So that was held February 15th, 16th in Arlington, Virginia, and it was attended by over 50 managers representing all 3 East Coast Fishery Management Councils, as well as the Atlantic States Commission and NOAA Fisheries. So it was a really great group of folks, including many of you, with about 10 people from each organization participating. And the goal of that summit was to set up, to develop a set of potential governance and management recommendations or potential actions that resulted from the scenario-based exploration of the future. So I'll describe sort of the process of the summit and some of the major themes that came out of it, but it is important to note that we did not seek consensus from the summit participants on these issues. So we ended up with a list of potential actions and some degree of prioritization of those resulting from the summit, but it will still be up to the management bodies, both individually and collectively, to determine which of them to pursue and on what time frame. And so I'll touch on that under next steps a little bit. So just to back up a little bit, just a quick reminder of our scenario framework that was created last year. This again was a platform for these discussions of applications at the summit. And on the one axis, you've seen this a bunch of times at this point, but the one axis has the predictability of conditions and our ability of our science to assess our changing ecosystem and stock distribution and other metrics, from unpredictable on the one side to being a little bit more predictable on the other side. And the other axis is stock productivity and replacement, from declining or mostly declining to mostly maintained or increasing. And from this, we built our 4 scenarios and developed narratives around those that the councils previously reviewed. So when it comes to the applications, we've been considering, including at the summit meeting, we've been considering various actions that we might take in response to those scenarios and in preparation for kind of ending up in one or some combination of the scenario quadrants. So this slide has a little bit of scenario planning theory, and I won't cover it in too much detail, but just as a quick reminder, there's different types of actions or strategies that you might pursue as the result of a scenario planning initiative, including robust actions in that center part of the scenario, where we can identify things that might be good things to do under any of these future scenarios and any combination of future conditions. We know there are things that would work out well, or at least not harm us. There are a couple other strategies here that we can think about, or ways we can identify actions, including, you can take small actions that prepare for certain futures that may not be applicable in every scenario. You could, that bet the farm or visioning action might be to try to make a particular version of the future happen, or to try to nudge us in that direction, while there are also that extremes corner might be to try to avoid a particular future or prepare for the worst case scenario. So these are not necessarily, all the types of actions that we don't necessarily have to take all of these different types of actions, but this was a way to frame the conversation around, different things we might think about in response to some of these scenarios as we discussed options at the summit. So going into the summit meeting, just through this animation here, the core team sort of prepared for the summit discussions by trying to organize the summit comments and ideas that have been made at previous meetings and in previous phases of the initiative throughout the application phase. We tried to organize those around 3 overarching themes and developing our briefing materials accordingly. And so what we ended up doing was structuring the conversation around the 3 themes of cross-jurisdictional governance, managing under increasing uncertainty, and data sources and partnerships. So the first one, obviously, the cross-jurisdictional governance has been a focus of this initiative from the start and has come across as something that's really very important to address. This is something that's going to be important to consider regardless of which scenario we might end up in. The second, managing under increasing uncertainty, is a little bit more of a prominent issue when you think about the left side of the scenario framework, where conditions become more and more unpredictable, although there's some element of that that's applicable in any scenario as well. Data sources and partnerships, again, probably relevant under any scenario, but a little bit more prominent under conditions where we might expect that we have high predictability and ability to assess. We are thinking that this is going to be highly related to the quality of the data inputs we have and the partnerships created to obtain that data and evaluate it. So this was kind of the way that we were organizing the conversation. And when we went to develop briefing materials around those three themes, we provided participants with some organizing questions to think about under each theme. For governance, that included thinking about what's the best structure and representation for our East Coast governance structure. When and how should management authority change? Can we improve the way that we do joint fishery management plans? And can we think about other ways to improve coordination and collaboration? For managing under uncertainty, there was a lot of conversation about how to increase flexibility, adaptability, and robustness, how to better accommodate uncertainty in the stock assessment process and management uncertainty, and how can we improve the ability for fishermen and stakeholders to adapt to climate change. For data sources and partnerships, the questions focused around how to prioritize data and information needed to manage in a changing environment, how to use current funding more efficiently, and how to better utilize the fishing industry data or fishing industry for data collection, and then the best ways to foster outside partnerships for sharing data, especially as other ocean users become more prominent. So those were the sort of framing questions we went into for the summit. And at the summit meeting itself, we started with the core team sort of giving an overview of those three themes and those guiding questions. And then most of the first day was spent in breakout groups, rotating through the three major themes to discuss each of those topics and to generate ideas about potential actions. And so we had a really good discussion and content from those breakout groups, and the core team basically reviewed those notes at the end of day one and distilled them into sort of common themes, common ideas of potential actions. So going into the second day, we ended up having a refined list of about 8 to 12 different potential actions under each theme for the group to consider. Some of these were more specific and actionable than others, so it was a pretty wide range of potential actions. And I think it's important to keep in mind that a lot of these will need additional thought about how to proceed with them as we try to begin to address some of them. So I don't have all of the specific ideas listed out in this slide and in this presentation, so I won't cover them all individually, but I do have a couple slides coming up about these sort of overall themes and some of the more prominent ideas that came through. But more details will be available in the summit report on that. On day 2 of the summit, we held a prioritization exercise after some additional sort of breakout groups to clarify each of the potential actions. So we used a sticker dot voting exercise where everybody got 8 votes to put on different potential actions, using the criteria of thinking about things that are going to help managers prepare for and cope with climate change, things that we might be able to influence, and things that are feasible to implement or that we could make progress toward. So this wasn't meant to be an exercise to necessarily eliminate ideas or to show what was unimportant, because we do recognize that many of these actions still probably have value or may have value, even if they didn't end up getting a lot of dot votes. This exercise was meant to sort of show the issues that were rising to the top as the things that folks most wanted to talk about and most wanted to dig into trying to address. So it wasn't intended to be an overly quantitative method, but just a way to kind of frame the next parts of the conversation. So now I'll go through and each theme and just kind of summarize some of the main ideas that came out. Again, not comprehensively at this stage, but just trying to communicate some of the more supported actions and a couple other actions that were suggested. So for cross-jurisdictional governance, there was a lot of support for generally rethinking our governance structure and different opinions on how we might best do that. But there was a recognition that a lot of the governance structure changes that were suggested would require changes to Magnuson, which I think a lot of folks just felt at this stage is a bit of a non-starter. A lot of folks wanted to start with looking at changes within our existing structure that may help alleviate some of the challenges we're facing. There was a lot of support for moving toward more consistency in the use and the structure of committees between the 3 East Coast councils. A lot of folks felt this could address some of the representation concerns without changes in Magnuson, and this would be sort of in combination with reevaluating committee representation and membership, and making the role of committees a bit more prominent and consistent between the 3 councils to sort of address some of the representation concerns. There was support for better mechanisms for information exchange between our scientific and statistical committees, particularly for species with joint management or cross-boundary stocks. There was some desire to find ways to improve coordination between NOAA fisheries offices within and across regions. There were also some discussions about clarifying and possibly reconsidering the role of council liaisons, potentially allowing for council proxies for appointed members to alleviate some workload concerns, to evaluate advisory panel representation for each body and for each FMP, and to develop improved and more explicit agreements for joint management. So those are kind of generally the cross-jurisdictional governance themes. For managing under increased uncertainty, there was, and some of these are, I guess, a little bit more conceptual, perhaps, support for improving and better operationalizing risk policies for the councils and commission, increasing focus on developing robust management strategies as opposed to increasingly trying to capture more and more uncertainties in models, and because we're never going to capture it all, just moving more toward robust management strategies. There was support for looking into whether spatial management considerations might be needed, and this was brought up earlier today, for species with changing distributions. For example, maybe different considerations are needed at the leading and trailing edge for species that are clearly changing their distribution. So there's some support for best practices for looking at more use of if-then structures in management, so frameworks that have an if-then kind of response built in, with the aim of increasing predictability and nimbleness when you need to, when you know you're going to need a quick response for something in response to changing conditions. Some other potential actions included increased use of community vulnerability analyses, streamlining compliance with the National Environmental Policy Act, identifying and removing institutional baggage, and improving the understanding of the permitting landscape across the East Coast, which it was recognized that that issue in particular also has an intersection with governance, as do many of these. For data sources and partnerships, there was broad support for more standardization of data collection to break down geographic barriers along the East Coast at both the state and federal levels. There was a lot of desire to prioritize recreational data collection improvements to reduce uncertainty, and also that included exploration of the idea of a recreational study fleet. There was desire to modernize data management systems to facilitate better data sharing and to prepare for new data streams that we might create or encounter. And some other potential actions included looking at survey mitigation efforts for offshore wind areas, exploring artificial intelligence or other technologies, perhaps to more rapidly process data and get data into assessments, looking at a better process between management and science to prioritize our data needs for climate-ready management, and that includes human dimensions data. So that was sort of just kind of an overview of some of the issues that came up a lot during that discussion. So we did, following the dot voting exercise at the summit, we did hold a plenary discussion where everyone was together discussing the top 3 issues that were identified through that process for each theme. And those are shown on this slide. I'm not going to go over these in detail. They're mostly a slightly different wording of what I just covered. But for each of these, we tried to get the full group to identify both some quick wins and some first steps toward long-term progress. So I won't get into the detail of that exactly, but that will be available in the forthcoming report. But these were sort of the top 3 issues under each category that we're focused on for the remainder of the summit meeting. But there was also a recognition that issues outside of these top three were also important to consider moving forward with. So for next steps, there would be more of a full picture of the conversations and potential actions available in the report. So our first step is to finalize that for the NRCC meeting, which will be held May 9th and 10th. In addition to the summit report, the core team is working on a second document that will be a draft action plan for the NRCC to review and comment on. So we wanted to be able to report on the summit proceedings and the summit report, and then expand a little bit on that and potentially explore additional possible next steps in a format that hopefully helps the NRCC determine a path forward. And that second document will also allow the NRCC to think about some general process recommendations about how to carry out this work, including, which group or groups should be the ones to take some of these actions on. How should this be coordinated? How do we ensure that progress is made on these items? How do we prioritize? How do we focus continued coordination and allocation of resources on this project and on these potential actions? So in terms of next steps for our council, the Mid-Atlantic, we will have plan to have this council revisit this later in 2023 with further discussion of the summit report and the outcomes of the NRCC meeting, and talk about some next steps there, including integrating this likely into our 2024 implementation plan and other council-specific plans or next steps that we can sort of formulate after the NRCC meets on this. So I believe that is all I have for the presentation, and I'm happy to take any questions or further discuss any of the ideas that came up in the presentation. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Kylie. As you mentioned, when you started the presentation, a number of you were able to participate, and I want to thank you for giving your time for that. I was not able to be there in attendance. One question I have for you, and maybe you can just provide generally kind of your longer, well, it's not necessarily a long-term thought, but the last point here that you're making says that this could potentially be integrated into the 2024 implementation plan. I mean, that's around the corner for that. I assume there's time between now and then to kind of get a better handle on what these next steps might look like. But as far as integrating it into the 2024 plan, are you envisioning that certain specific actions may end up being taken up based on discussions? I mean, there's a lot to this. There's a lot of meat in there, especially that last table that you showed, which kind of offers some thoughts as to how we might make adjustments based on climate change and the scenarios that were provided. So maybe you can speak a little bit to what you think 2024 could look like as far as potential actions. I'll leave it there and see if you have any thoughts.
Yeah, so I think it's a little hard to say exactly what that would look like at this point, what exactly would be in there in the 2024 implementation plan. But the idea is that, we're going to have some actions that maybe would be Mid-Atlantic Council specific, or maybe would be Mid-Atlantic Council in cooperation with, one or two other groups, or maybe there's some agreement that everyone wants to move toward a common goal across all the participating bodies that we need to do some work on in 2024. So I think there's really a range of different possibilities, and it kind of depends on what the NRCC says and what our council's desires are. There's a number of different possibilities, I think, depending on what's most important to this council and to the broader participants in this process. So not sure exactly what it'll look like, but I think there's a lot of work that could be done, that could be at least started in 2024. And of course, that's just 1 year. So it would be, a couple actions and a start at tackling some of these issues.
Okay, thanks. That's kind of what I was expecting. One last question. So if we do have actions that we're considering down the road, I mean, this was not a Mid-Atlantic Council process. This was a joint process with 3 councils, the commission, the science center, the regional offices. Would there need to be buy-in, do you think, from all of the different entities that went into this work in order to get certain things done down the road? Or, I mean, I don't know what was discussed at the summit, if that came up as to whether or not each council or each entity would then kind of work from what was developed, or is it all going to be joint, moving forward?
I think that's a great question that, we hope to get some feedback from the NRCC on exactly how this will work, whether the NRCC is the appropriate body to continue sort of overseeing this or not, knowing that it doesn't include the South Atlantic. And just, in terms of logistics of prioritizing, making sure there's momentum, that there's continued coordination. I think those conversations need to be started at the NRCC, but there's also a range of different types of actions identified here that some of them could be some things that this council could just take on to identify, efficiencies in our own process following some of the themes that came out of the summit. Or we could take up an action, reviewing our joint plans with the commission, for example. Stuff like that is not everything is going to require a huge coordinated effort with everyone along the coast. There are actions that we could probably move forward with. And then there are some that definitely, in order to make any meaningful progress, you would really need everyone on board and everyone giving the same amount of effort toward it. So it depends on which issue we're talking about.
Sure. Thank you, Kylie. Mike Penny?
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chairman. I think Kylie touched on it really well, covered it really well. I think, the intent is to bring this to the NRCC, which the genesis of the scenario planning work started at the NRCC in South Carolina a number of years ago. And, we have, using the NRCC, which typically is the Northeast Region Coordinating Council, but we have been engaged with the South Atlantic Council as well. My understanding is John Carmichael from the South Atlantic Council is planning to attend the meeting on May 9th, where we'll be discussing this. So South Atlantic Council will be engaged with us. I expect that to continue. If there are things that come out of this May meeting, and the NRCC wants to revisit some of these issues at the fall meeting, I would expect we would continue to invite representation from the South Atlantic Council to participate in those meetings. So that's sort of at the higher level of the NRCC, sort of working regionally. But as Kylie very well said, some of the actions that may come out of this are things that the Mid-Atlantic Council and the Commission together can work on, or things that between myself and John Hare, the agency needs to work on in terms of data collection and other things that would address some of the actions. So I think there's a range of actions that could potentially come out of this at all levels, from things that are within the agency's control or within one council's control, all the way up to things that would require coordination across all the members of the NRCC, including the South Atlantic Council.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Okay, let me turn to members of the council. Does anyone have any questions for Kylie? Any comments, thoughts regarding the presentation, regarding maybe something you learned at the summit? I heard nothing but good things about it, by the way, Kylie. So, Eric Reed.
See anyone else's hand up, but it's not to say what a fabulous job the core team did. Mr. Dancy, Mr. Ford, the IT staff, Mr. Pearson, Shelley. They did a great job herding a room full of people with a lot of varying ideas. So they should be commended more than anything. That's my comment. Thank you.
Yeah, excellent. And again, I heard very similar things from others who were there. A couple people from my staff were also there, and they said nothing but good things about how the summit was presented. Anyone else? Dr. Hare.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have two things. One, I agree 100% with Eric. I think it was the 2014 East Coast Governance Workshop. We came out of that with, very different place than out of this climate scenario workshop. But I think Eric's exactly right. It's a testament to the core team. So thank you for having us come out of that in an excellent place. And then something we didn't talk about this at climate scenario planning, but I think it's important for us to, I don't know if we can add it to the list or add it to some other list, But I think Mr. Fletcher's comment was very insightful, and it's hard to believe we didn't talk about it at the governance conference or workshop, and it has come up in the past. Each council is taking a different approach to ecosystem-based management. Climate change is, one facet of ecosystem-based management, and so, at least we should be, coordinating, understanding what the different councils are doing, what the commission is doing, and perhaps aligning. And that comment has been made before by others, but I think it's just a very insightful avenue for us to think about how do we align our ecosystem approaches across the East Coast of the United States. So just something to either put on the climate scenario list or some other list for us to talk about.
Hey, thanks, John. You're a better man than I am for being able to remember 2014. Seems like a million years ago. Anyone else around the table? Is there anyone from the public, from the audience? Has anything they'd like to ask or offer as comment? Bonnie Brady. Go ahead, Bonnie.
Hey, Mike, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, as usual, I'm in the car. Bonnie Brady, Long Island Commercial Fishing Association. This is not so much regarding this last part of your climate change workshop, since I was not in attendance for that, but this was regarding an outside conversation, but about the same topic as it related to the issue of permits and working across dual councils and what that would do to the value of the permits. And this was a question, and Mike, maybe I can, Mike Pentney, if I could bring this subject up again. This was from the seafood show where I had asked about how would you be attempting to make fishermen that have spent money at a grand scheme to purchase permits of different states, in the case of New York fishermen for the fluke fishery, in essence being able to take regulatory discards and turn them into landings at great cost. And your response, I believe one of those options was to allow for flexible landings. However, flexible landings, when you don't have processing in our state, which we've lost more than 20 years ago, would just further flood our market. And right now, the fluke fishery is probably one of the least priced fish since, I want to say, Christmas. I think there's got to be a lot more thought toward compensatory damages for any kind of loss of permits and the expenses that would be required, especially for states that were traditionally and historically on the low end of the quota totem pole. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Bonnie, for your comment. Okay, I still have John and Bonnie's hands up, but I'm going to skip those for now. Is there anyone else from the public? James Fletcher.
James Fletcher, United National Fishermen's Association. We're here again. We have all these organizations. I asked the question, why can't all of these bright people come up with a way to totally utilize all of the catch that we run into commercially or recreationally? Why can't we utilize all of the resource? Thank you.
Thank you, James. Is there anyone else from the public before I come back to the council just a second, Dewey? I'll give folks online a second to raise their hand. Seeing none online and seeing none in the audience, we'll go ahead and bring it back to the council. Dewey Hemmelwright.
Yeah, I would hope in the future, if you had public comments, that when folks come to ask questions to the council, they would also give scenarios of how they would plan on fixing it. simple utilization of all the catch doesn't tell how many times you get to sit, doesn't tell how many days you get to fish. So when you come up with a theory of asking council or staff the reasons why, it might be good also to include some further background to give folks to think on the analysis that where you're at, given that it's public comment. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Dewey. And I think sometimes the concept and the interest of the sector differ in that for recreational fishing, time on the water is typically something that recreational anglers would like. They'd like the opportunity, and in a scenario where you're utilizing all of the catch, it may reduce the amount of time spent on the water. So, you know, that's an example of where you're going as far as providing that information for a basis for discussion. Is there anyone else from the council? Okay. Seeing none at this time, let me thank Kylie for the presentation. A few of us will look forward to hearing it again in a few weeks up in Gloucester, and we'll look forward to the final report at the conclusion of the next few months and next steps moving forward. So thank you very much. With that, I'm going to go ahead and call this meeting in recess until tomorrow. Before I turn things over to Chris, I do want to point out that we don't do this very often, but for those of you who are new around the table, tomorrow's morning session is a meeting. It's a mackerel, squid, and butterfish committee meeting as a committee of the whole. So what that means is all of you need to be here. Peter Hughes is going to chair the committee meeting, which will have representatives from the committee from New England participating in that discussion, as well as all of you who are members of the council and not necessarily members of the committee. So everyone is should be in attendance tomorrow. I just wanted to point that out in case you've seen that for the first time and weren't aware that you're expected to be here for that meeting tomorrow. So, and thank you, Peter, for taking the reins on running that committee meeting tomorrow. Okay, I'm going to turn things over to Chris to announce hospitality.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We will have hospitality tonight. It'll start when you get there. The room is 627, so 627. See you there. Everyone's invited. Thanks.
Okay, we're done for the day. We'll see everyone later tonight or tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. Thank you.